Chapter 29. A Girl with No Name. We had a tearful goodbye with Roman the next morning, then packed our bags with food, an empty tin can to use as a drinking cup, our papers, the little money we'd managed to save, and the photographs. Alice put her hair in a tidy braid and looped her red pioneer tie around the collar of her newly washed blouse. I slicked my clean hair back with water and put my own red devil's noose onto my own clean collar. We walked past the train station and went north, first following the tracks, and then on a dirt road that paralleled the tracks. My inclination had been to travel with the road in sight, but not on it, because it felt like what we were doing had to be hidden. But Alice pointed out that doing so would make us look like we had something to hide. Better to walk on the road, our day bags over our shoulders, like loyal communists with a place to go. Once we got into the country, the air smelled different. It took me a while to realize that it wasn't just because there were trees and streams and wide open spaces, but because there was no all-pervasive stench of rotting corpses. As we walked, I thought about the journeys I had made with Slavko. Back then, it was about keeping our family together and safe. Now, my parents were dead, and this trip took me farther away from my siblings. The Kolhots at Filivka was Yulia's home, but definitely not mine, and our shattered house had likely been torn down by now. Slavko considered Traktorsloy his home, while to me, it was a place of punishment, not refuge. I had pinned my hopes on a new home with Auntie Paulina in Ternopil, but that dream had fallen through too. Would I ever find home again? I took a deep breath, then slowly let it out. I would concentrate on what I could do instead of worrying about what I couldn't. I glanced over at Alice, who was as silent as me and had a serious look on her face. She still had a home and a grandmother in Canada, and it was possible she might be able to save her father. And I would help her in any way I could. "What are you thinking about?" I asked. "About how beautiful this all was," she said, raising her arms to include the sky, the fields, the meadows. "There is so much potential for happiness, for goodness here." "You're right about that," I said. We walked in silent contemplation for a couple of kilometers, then encountered a village. The clay cottages, with their straw thatch roofs, seemed achingly familiar, and in normal times, I would have expected to see some chickens clucking around, and maybe a cow in the pasture. But these were not normal times. In the heat of August, the village was quiet like winter. No people, no birds, no insects. We followed the dirt road deeper into the village, and I wrinkled my nose at the stench. Alice put a hand over her mouth. She could smell it too. It was fainter than in Kharkiv, but unmistakable. At the time of year when everything should be bursting with life, this village was filled with death. We kept on walking, our heads bowed in sadness, past what had been the village square and past where a church had been, but now was just rubble. Reclining against the doorstep of the last house was a young girl, maybe 6 years old. At first, I thought she was dead. But then she slowly opened her eyes. Her lips moved, but no words came out. We went up to her and knelt beside her. "Bread?" she whispered. I opened my shoulder bag. I had a small piece of the soft bread left from the night before. I placed it in her hand. The girl tried to bring it to her lips, but she was too weak. I broke off a bit and put it between her teeth, but her mouth was too dry. Alice took the tin can from her bag and went to the back of the house. She reappeared moments later, the tin can filled with water. She held it to the girl's lips. The girl took a sip. Once she'd swallowed a bit of water, I placed the bread back on her tongue. She closed her mouth and slowly chewed. A smile transformed her face. "That is the most wonderful meal I have ever tasted," said the girl. "I can die happy now." We stayed sitting with the girl and offered her more bread. but she said that she was full. "Can you sing to me?" she asked. I have a terrible singing voice, but started the kolisanka that Mama sang to me as a baby about rocking in a cradle. It was one that Uncle Ilya and Auntie Paulina had recorded in their manuscript. Alice knew it too, and she joined in. The little girl looked so content that we sang it over and over. I thought the girl had fallen asleep, but Alice put her fingers on the girl's neck. "She is no longer with us," she said. We didn't want to leave her sitting in the doorway. In the end, I carried her gently in my arms to the church cemetery and laid her body down on one of the graves. Alice and I wrapped our arms around each other and wept. We had been immersed in death for so long that I thought we had become hardened to it. But seeing this little girl die before our eyes was a breaking point. "We don't even know her name," I said. "She wasn't alone when she died," said Alice. She gathered up a handful of dirt and sprinkled it over the girl. Together, we sang Vichnaya Pamyach. And then we walked out of the village and down the road. There were more than a dozen villages between the outskirts of Kharkiv and the border between Ukraine and Russia. And all of those villages were terrible in their similarities, like Winterkill in the heat of August. The stench of death, the emptiness, and the harvest without food. At one of the villages, a grizzled old man took us into his house. He told us that during the harvest, the locals were too weakened with starvation to go out in the fields and work, so the army brought in Russian farmers to do the harvest. "The army fed the Russian farmers so little that they all got sick," he said. "But at least they got something." "What about your garden?" asked Alice. "Don't you at least have tomatoes, potatoes?" "They've taken everything," said the man. "Even if they find you picking up dropped ears of wheat, they'll shoot you." "How is it that you're still alive?" I asked. "Take a look," he said, taking the lid off a foul-smelling cooking pot. Grass, weeds, a leather boot, one dead rat, all boiling together in water. "That's what I've got left. Come winter, I'll die." Our food would have lasted the entire 3 days and 65 kilometers had we not shared. But how could we not? We did have our tin cup, and we drank water whenever we could. When we were about 10 kilometers from the border, Alice said, "I need to rest." "We should just keep walking," I said. "If we stop when we're so weak, we won't get back up." But it was too late. Alice's knees buckled beneath her, and she crumpled onto the road. "I just need to rest my eyes," she said. "I'm so tired." "Okay," I said, "but just for a few minutes." I helped her to the side of the road, then rolled my coat into a pillow and placed it under her head. I sat down beside her and wrapped my arms around my knees. My intention was to stay awake and keep watch, but I fell asleep. When I woke up, I was in a donkey cart that was jolting and swaying along a rutted road. An old man walked alongside the donkey, his hand looped around the strap to a leather harness. Alice lay beside me, loose like a discarded rag doll. I put my hand on her wrist and felt her pulse beat strongly. I said a silent prayer of thanks. Another kid lay still and cold in death, and I whispered a prayer for him as well. I crawled back over to Alice and tried to shake her awake. I desperately wanted to get out of this death wagon, but I couldn't leave Alice. Just then, the cart stopped. I slumped down and closed my eyes, pretending to be dead. I could hear the man's boots swishing through the field, then him picking something up with a grunt. A few minutes later, a body crashed down on me. The donkey started back on its slow walk. I opened my eyes to the sight of brown eyes clouded with death staring back at me. The body was so light that it was like moving a bundle of firewood when I squirmed out from beneath him. I gently rolled him over beside the other corpse, then went to check on Alice. She was still breathing, but also still deep in sleep. The wagon took a sharp turn, then climbed the hill. I lay down between Alice and the corpses when it stopped. The man came around to the back of the wagon and grabbed one of the dead kids. I heard a whoosh and a thump. A few moments later, he grabbed me. I kept my eyes closed and tried to keep my body slack. He tossed me down a hill. My back hit the ground first. I tucked in my arms and kept rolling, then stopped abruptly when I smacked up against something hard. Maybe the man would shoot me if he knew I was alive, so I lay there playing dead as the rot of death filled my nostrils. Another body rolled on top of me, and then Alice smashed down. "What? What?" said Alice, her eyes fluttering open. Thank goodness she was finally awake. "Shh," I whispered. "Pretend you're dead." Miraculously, she didn't scream or gasp, but just went silent. We waited there in the vast death pit, amid the bodies for 15 minutes or more. I stared up at the hot blue August sky and saw ravens circling above. It reminded me of the ravens that hovered over the mass grave where Tato's body was discarded. My heart ached at the thought of so many dead people and fat crows. "Can we get up yet?" asked Alice. "He's probably gone by now," I said, standing up myself, then helping Alice to her feet. We slowly took in the horror around us. A vista of sun-bleached skulls and bones as far as the eye could see. Thrown like so much rubbish on top were fresher bodies. How many mass graves were there throughout the countryside? "Let's get out of here," said Alice. I knew that horrible climb through the pit of death would stay etched in my nightmares forever. But even amid all that destruction was a glimmer of hope. A small hand stretched out toward us, cold and still in death, but with fingers gripped around a piece of rough black bread. "Would it be sacrilege to take that?" I asked. "It would be sacrilege not to," said Alice. We stood there among the dead, and they broke off 2 small pieces of bread, just enough to stave off the swelling. I said a prayer of thanks. When we got out of the pit, I didn't know which way to go. "North is this way," said Alice, using the sunset to orient us. We walked as far away from the pit as we could get, while it was still light enough to do so. We found a stream to slake our thirst, and then crumpled into the field and slept. At dawn, we walked again, and walked and walked. Another stream and more water. Another bite of bread. It was hours later when we heard the gunshots.